God says, "My beloved, hear me now." God says, today is not just any day. God says, a blessing unlike any other has been set aside for you, a gift that will alter the course of your life in ways you cannot yet imagine. God says, you have been given a lot of money, a divine inheritance from the heavens themselves. God says, but there is a condition, a simple act of faith, a moment of obedience. God says, if you do not open this message today by 11 p.m., you will forfeit what is rightfully yours. God says, this is not an ordinary opportunity, this is a divine opening, and time is moving faster than you realize. God says, do not delay, do not hesitate, for every second that passes without your attention is a second that diminishes your blessing. God says, open this message, read it with your heart, with the faith of a child who trusts completely in my word, and watch as what seemed impossible becomes inevitable. God says, you are safe. God says, nothing will go wrong with you because I am watching, I am protecting, I am surrounding you with a shield of my mercy. God says, you may feel fear, doubt, uncertainty, but God says, cast it aside, for fear and doubt have no place where faith resides. God says, trust me. God says, pray to me. God says, speak my name with reverence, with gratitude, with urgency. God says, your prayers have been heard, and this moment, this very hour, is the culmination of what you have been seeking, of what you have been asking for in your silent whispers to me. God says, this money, this blessing, it is not just for survival, it is not just for comfort. God says, it is a key, a portal, a turning point that will unlock doors you didn't even know existed, that will bring you into circles of influence, abundance, and divine favor. God says, the enemy has been watching. God says, the forces of doubt and distraction have been waiting for you to falter. God says, but today, God says, you are under my protection. God says, the money is secure, it is yours, but you must act. God says, when I tell you to open, do not delay. God says, hesitation will cost you more than you can imagine. God says, when you feel the temptation to ignore this, when the world whispers that this is impossible, God says, remember my word, remember my promises. God says, I have never failed you, and I will not fail you now. God says, you are exactly where you need to be, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right position to receive what is meant for you. God says, your faith has been tested, and today it is proven. God says, you are ready. God says, close your eyes for a moment and feel my presence. God says, breathe in the peace I am giving you. God says, breathe out the fear, the hesitation, the distraction. God says, know that I am with you, that I am guiding you, that every detail of this blessing has been orchestrated by my hand. God says, no one can intercept it, no one can prevent it. God says, all that is required is your obedience, your trust, your willingness to accept the divine gift. God says, money is not the end. God says, it is a tool, a sign, a confirmation that you are walking in alignment with me, with my plan, with the path that leads to your highest destiny. God says, imagine the doors that will open, the people who will come into your life, the opportunities that will manifest, all because you acted when I commanded. God says, do not delay, do not overthink. God says, open this now, and the flow of blessings will begin. God says, there is a spiritual urgency here. God says, every moment you wait, the blessing is still there, but the timing is critical. God says, divine timing is precise. God says, heaven moves swiftly for those who respond to my call. God says, do not let worldly distractions pull you away from this moment. God says, even if everything around you seems chaotic, God says, remain focused on my word. God says, the money you are about to receive is tied to your faith, your clarity, your readiness to accept. God says, open this message, follow my instructions, and watch as your life shifts in ways that will astonish you. God says, this is not exaggeration. God says, this is truth. God says, miracles are not distant dreams, they are here, they are real, and they are yours. God says, when you open this, feel the energy, the vibration of divine favor. God says, know that every cent, every dollar, every aspect of this blessing is infused with my power, my love, my protection. God says, it is not for harm, it is not for selfish gain alone. God says, it is for empowerment, for healing, for establishing your life on a foundation that cannot be shaken. God says, your heart will know it, your mind will recognize it, your spirit will rejoice. God says, this is the culmination of prayers you have uttered in secrecy, of tears you have shed in quiet desperation, of hope you have carried when it seemed nothing was coming. God says, today, all of that is answered. God says, there may be voices that try to dissuade you. God says, friends, strangers, even your own doubts may rise. God says, ignore them. God says, listen only to me. God says, the clarity, the certainty, the command you feel in your soul is from me. God says, act now, before the hour passes. God says, 11 p.m. is the cutoff, the moment when the flow of this blessing will pause if ignored. God says, do not allow procrastination to rob you of what is rightfully yours. God says, you were chosen, God says, and the heavens are aligned for you. God says, I have prepared this. God says, I have orchestrated it. God says, I am present in every detail, every calculation, every timing. God says, it is perfect, it is complete, it is unstoppable, but only if you act. God says, open your hands, open your heart, open this message. God says, receive without fear, without doubt. God says, trust that what you receive is more than enough, more than you imagined, more than you dared to hope for. God says, I am your provider, your sustainer, your constant guide. God says, today is a pivotal moment. God says, the decisions you make in these coming minutes will echo through your life for years to come. God says, do not underestimate the significance of obedience, of faith, of trust. God says, the money, the abundance, the blessing is just the beginning. God says, it is a symbol, a confirmation. A divine nod that you are on the right path. God says, you are not alone, you are never alone, you are deeply loved, deeply watched, and deeply cherished. God says, prepare yourself. God says, quiet your mind. God says, remove all distractions. God says, focus only on this message. God says, read every word, absorb every command, and act immediately. God says, the universe, heaven, and I are conspiring to deliver this to you. God says, every detail has been aligned. God says, all that remains is your readiness to receive. God says, do not doubt, do not question. God says, open it, now. God says, if you act, the money will flow to you with divine precision. God says, your life will shift. Your heart will expand, your spirit will rejoice. God says, the blessings will multiply beyond your imagination. God says, this is not exaggeration, this is divine reality. God says, remember, this is time sensitive. God says, today, by 11 p.m., you must open this message. God says, heaven will wait no longer than it must. God says, the energy, the alignment, the flow of this blessing is at its peak now. God says, when you hesitate, even a moment, the opportunity begins to diminish. God says, the money is yours, but only if you act. God says, there is no reason to doubt, no reason to delay. God says, open now. God says, feel my presence, feel my guidance, feel my love. God says, everything you have ever asked for, everything you have ever hoped for, everything you have ever dreamed of is being delivered to you. God says, all that remains is for you to receive it. God says, act with urgency, with faith, with clarity. God says, do not let fear, doubt, or distraction take this from you. God says, the blessing, the money, the abundance, the divine gift is waiting. God says, open this message, now. God says, trust me, obey me, follow my command. God says, this is your moment. God says, embrace it. God says, you are safe. God says, you are protected. God says, you are deeply loved. God says, nothing will go wrong with you. God says, this is divine, this is urgent, this is yours. God says, open it now. God says, my beloved child, hear my voice, hear it deeply, for this message is only for you, and it comes from the very heart of heaven. God says, today is a day unlike any other, a day where the divine blessings that have been waiting for you, that have been hidden in the folds of time and the quiet spaces of your life, are finally arriving. God says, you have been given a lot of money, a gift so immense, a blessing so powerful, that it is beyond human calculation, beyond anything the mind can fully grasp. God says, this is not an ordinary gift, this is a miracle delivered from heaven, a manifestation of divine abundance that has been tailored for you and you alone, God says, but listen carefully. My child, there is urgency in this message. God says, if you do not open this message today, by the stroke of 11 p.m., you will risk losing this blessing. God says, the clock is moving, the hours are passing, and the opportunity that heaven has prepared for you is delicate, precise, and cannot wait. God says, open this quickly, otherwise, you will miss out. God says, the abundance meant for your life, meant to change your circumstances, to release the chains of worry, fear, and limitation, will not remain unclaimed indefinitely. God says, it is your faith, your readiness, and your action that allows this blessing to flow into your life fully and completely. God says, you must understand, my beloved child, that this money, this divine provision, is not simply about material wealth. God says, it is about freedom, it is about security, it is about opening doors that have remained closed for too long. God says, it is about the fulfillment of dreams that you may have thought impossible, the realization of visions that have lived quietly in your heart for years. God says, do not underestimate the power of what is coming to you, for it is a direct act of God's love and favor. God says, do not fear, for nothing will go wrong with you. God says, rest assured in this truth, you are safe, you are protected, you are shielded by my divine presence. God says, even if the world appears chaotic, even if doubts arise and shadows try to sway your heart, know that God is with you. God says, angels surround you, the light of heaven surrounds you, and nothing in the natural or spiritual realm can diminish the blessing that has been designated for you. God says, all you must do is trust, trust completely, trust with all your heart, and open this message without hesitation. God says, the timing of this blessing is critical. God says, heaven moves in perfect alignment with the moments of your life, and today, right now, is the appointed time. God says, delay is dangerous, hesitation is unnecessary, and doubt will not serve you. God says, the act of opening this message is itself an act of faith, an act of surrender to divine will, and it activates the flow of blessing into your life. God says, every second that passes brings you closer to missing the opportunity, and every second you act in faith draws the blessing nearer. God says, this money is not just a number, not just an account balance, not just a symbol of success. God says, It is a tool of transformation, a key to new beginnings, a way for you to step into the life you were always meant to live. God says, it is a sign of divine favor, a confirmation that your prayers have been heard, that your struggles have been witnessed, that your heart has been recognized. God says, open this message today, and receive it with gratitude. With humility, with the full recognition that this is heaven's direct provision for you, God says, do not doubt for a moment that this is real. God says, some will question, some will say it is too good to be true, some will whisper skepticism into your ears. God says, ignore all of that, for they do not see what I see. God says, they do not understand the ways of heaven, they do not know the depth of love and care that is being poured into your life right now. God says, trust in me, trust in my timing, trust in my wisdom, and know that this message is sacred, urgent, and life-changing. God says, you have been patient, you have been faithful, you have endured trials, you have walked paths that were difficult. And God says, all of that has prepared you for this moment. God says, the blessing of money, the divine abundance, is not random. God says, it is a direct response to your heart, a reflection of your prayers, a fulfillment of your readiness. God says, open it now, open it before 11 p.m., and witness the miracle unfold. God says, it will come in ways that are visible and tangible, ways that will astonish you, ways that will confirm that nothing is impossible for God. God says, do not be afraid to receive, for receiving is your divine right. God says, embrace the blessing, accept it fully, and let it flow into every area of your life. God says, let it touch your home, your work, your relationships, your dreams, your health, your spirit. God says, let it bring relief where there has been struggle, hope where there has been despair, joy where there has been sorrow. God says, this is your time, this is your season, and it begins the moment you open this message with faith and readiness. God says, know that you are not alone. God says, angels, archangels, and the forces of heaven are working tirelessly on your behalf. God says, Archangel Michael stands beside you, guarding you, guiding you, ensuring that every obstacle is removed and every barrier is cleared. God says, this is not a test, this is not a trial, this is a gift, and it is waiting for you now. God says, act immediately. Do not delay, for heaven has coordinated every detail to ensure your success. God says, as you read this, feel the energy of blessing surrounding you. God says, feel the warmth, the light, the love that is being poured into your life. God says, let it penetrate every fiber of your being, let it ignite your spirit, let it awaken your faith. God says, open this message today, and let your heart rejoice in what is coming. God says, gratitude amplifies blessings, faith activates miracles, and trust unlocks abundance. God says, these are spiritual laws, eternal truths, and they are now aligning perfectly in your favor. God says, do not wait until tomorrow, for tomorrow is uncertain. God says, the hours leading to 11 p.m. are precious, sacred, and filled with divine energy. God says, each minute that passes is a moment where your readiness is tested, a moment where your faith is called into action, a moment where the blessing can either be claimed or missed. God says, choose to act, choose to trust, choose to open this message and step into the fullness of your divine inheritance. God says, even if you have doubted before, even if you have questioned before, God says, put all doubt aside. God says, now is the time for faith, for courage, for unwavering trust. God says, this money, this blessing, will arrive not as a trick, not as a fleeting opportunity, but as a tangible, undeniable miracle in your life. God says, it will confirm what you have always known deep in your heart, that God is real, God is loving, God is just, and God is with you in every moment. God says, as you open this, you are not only receiving financial abundance, but spiritual abundance as well. God says, your faith will be strengthened, your heart will be encouraged, your spirit will soar, and your life will shift into a higher frequency of blessing, peace, and joy. God says, everything that has been waiting, everything that has been promised, everything that heaven has whispered into your soul, is now available to you. God says, do not hesitate, do not question, do not delay. God says, open it now, and allow the miracle to flow. God says, even if challenges appear, even if uncertainty lingers, even if fear whispers in your ear, God says, remain steadfast. God says, the blessing cannot be stopped, it cannot be hindered, it cannot be diminished, if you open this message with faith and trust. God says, heaven is moving on your behalf, angels are clearing paths, opportunities are aligning, and divine favor is surrounding you. God says, this is your moment, your divine appointment, and it is urgent. God says, take a deep breath, feel my presence, feel the divine love that surrounds you, and open this message. God says, you are ready, you are chosen, you are worthy. And you are deeply loved. God says, the money, the abundance, the blessing, is waiting for you to claim it. God says, act now, for every second that passes brings you closer to the appointed hour of 11 p.m., and with that hour comes the conclusion of this divine opportunity. God says, open it, trust, receive, and rejoice. God says, nothing will go wrong with you, you are safe, you are loved, and all is well, because God is with you now and forever. God says, believe, act, open, and let the miracle transform your life. God says, heaven has chosen you, this moment has chosen you, and divine abundance is your reality. God says, the time is now, the blessing is yours, and faith is your key. God says, open it quickly, open it without hesitation, and receive the fullness of what heaven has prepared for you. God says, I am with you, I am guiding you, I am blessing you, and I am ensuring that nothing will harm you. God says, trust me completely, act with urgency, and step into the abundance that is your divine inheritance. God says, remember, this is not a coincidence, this is not luck, this is divine providence. God says, everything has been orchestrated, every detail arranged, every obstacle removed, so that you could receive this blessing fully. God says, do not let fear or doubt delay you, do not let hesitation rob you of what is rightfully yours, and do not ignore the urgency of this moment. God says, open this message, claim your money, embrace the blessing, and let your life be transformed in ways beyond your imagination. God says this message has been placed before you at a very intentional moment, and nothing in your life right now is happening by chance. You are reading this because heaven has been preparing a blessing for you that has finally reached your name, and God is making sure you don't miss it. God says you have been given a lot of money in the spiritual realm, more than you expected, more than you prayed for, more than anyone around you imagined for you, and this is the moment where heaven wants you to open your heart and receive it without fear, without hesitation, and without doubting yourself. God is saying that if you don't open this message today by 11 p.m., the blessing that has already been assigned to you may be delayed, not because God wants to punish you, but because your spiritual window is open right now, and God wants you to step into this moment with boldness and trust. God says you have been walking through seasons of uncertainty, and sometimes it has felt like everything was working against you. But heaven has been watching over every step you have taken, every tear you have cried, every silent prayer you have whispered, and every moment where you thought no one understood what was happening in your heart. God says you are safe, covered, protected, and guided. Nothing will go wrong with you because God is not leaving you, not turning away from you, not ignoring you, and not allowing anything harmful to touch your destiny. This moment is a turning point in your life, and God is telling you to trust, to breathe, to hold your faith steady. God says this message is being placed before you at this exact moment because heaven has already prepared a blessing with your name on it, a blessing so large that even the angels stood still when it was written in the divine book. God says you have been given a lot of money, but the spiritual realm is waiting for your response, your openness, your faith, and your willingness to receive it. God says if you do not open this message today by 11 p.m., you will not receive the wealth that has already been released into your destiny. This is not to scare you, but to awaken you, to shake you, to remind you that divine timing is real, and when heaven sets a moment, it is because that is the moment your life is meant to shift. God says open this quickly, because the window is small, and those who delay spiritual instructions often delay their own breakthroughs without realizing it. God says nothing will go wrong with you, you are safe, you are protected, and you are being guided through something powerful. You must trust God and pray, because heaven is moving with urgency on your behalf. God says there is a reason you found this exact message at this exact hour, a reason your heart felt a pull, a reason your spirit awakened. God says someone has been praying for you in the spiritual realm, angels, ancestors, divine guardians, and they have been waiting for you to step into the blessing prepared for you. God says you have suffered enough, waited enough, and cried enough. This is the time when heaven shifts the weight off your shoulders and places abundance into your hands. God says a lot of money has been aligned with you, money you never expected, money that will surprise even you, money that will feel unreal at first because your mind has been trained to struggle for so long. God says this blessing is not accidental. It is intentional. It is heaven approved. And it is time sensitive. God says there have been forces trying to block your blessing, individuals who doubted you, energies that tried to stop your progress. But heaven is not letting them succeed anymore. God says the reason this message carries urgency is because the spiritual deadline is real. If you delay, the blessing delays. But if you act, if you open your heart, if you trust, the blessing releases immediately. God says your hands are being prepared to receive something big, something life-changing, something that will break generational lack, something that will restore everything you lost. God says there is something incredibly special about you that heaven cannot ignore. You have survived things others could not. You have remained kind when people were unfair. You prayed when you were hurting. You trusted God in moments when you had every reason to give up. God says the money being released to you is not a reward for perfection, but a reward for perseverance. You kept walking. You kept surviving. You kept believing even when life didn't make sense. God says heaven has been watching every tear, every sacrifice, every moment you stayed strong even while feeling broken. This blessing is heaven's response to your endurance. God says the reason this message comes with urgency is because a shift in your spiritual timeline is happening tonight. Doors that were locked are opening. Paths that were blocked are clearing. Opportunities that were hidden are revealing themselves. God says there is a divine alignment around you, and you must not walk away from it, ignore it, or postpone it. God says you are standing at the edge of your breakthrough, and the slightest act of faith will push you fully into it. God says before 11 p.m. today, your spirit must acknowledge this message, because that acknowledgement is what seals the blessing and finalizes heaven's release. God says there are people who once laughed at you, doubted you, or judged you who will soon witness your rise. But God says don't focus on them. Focus on the transformation that is coming. God says the money being released is not just for physical comfort, it is meant to elevate you, position you, and open doors you never imagined. God says this money is part of your kingdom purpose, meant to lift you and also bless others through you. God says your story is about to inspire, heal, and empower people who are going through what you once went through. God says you may not fully understand why this message feels different, why it feels intense, why your heart feels pulled toward it, but God wants you to know that this is divine intervention. God says heaven steps into your timeline only when something important is about to occur, and this message is exactly that kind of moment. God says the angels have been instructed to surround you today, to protect you, to guide you, to keep you safe from any disruption that tries to interfere with your blessing. God says nothing will go wrong with you. You are safe. You are under divine protection. You simply need to trust and allow heaven to work in your life. God says part of the reason you are receiving this urgent message is because you have been walking through a season of spiritual transition without fully realizing it. You have been shedding old energies, releasing old patterns, and stepping into a new version of yourself. God says you have felt disconnected from certain people because heaven removed them from your path. You have felt strange shifts in your emotions because your spirit is preparing for elevation. You have been feeling moments of sudden hope or sudden heaviness because you are being spiritually rewired. God says this blessing is arriving now because you are ready for it in a way you weren't before. God says there is someone who tried to stop your progress, someone who wished you failure, someone who was intimidated by your destiny. But God says none of that matters anymore. Heaven has overridden every plot, cancelled every negative word, and broken every chain placed on your path. God says the money being released to you comes from a spiritual vault that cannot be touched by any enemy. God says you are walking into a season where your name will be associated with abundance, unexpected blessings, and divine turnarounds. God says you must not let fear interrupt what heaven is doing. Fear has delayed many blessings in your life, but it will not delay this one unless you let it. God says trust is the key that unlocks your wealth. God says pray. Speak your desire out loud. Affirm your faith. Open your spirit. Heaven is listening. God says your faith today will determine the size of your blessing. God says show heaven that you are ready to receive. God says there is a reason your heart feels warm, emotional, or stirred as you read this. That is your spirit responding to divine truth. God says your blessings have been blocked not because of lack, but because of timing. And the time is now. God says before tonight at 11 p.m., the spiritual atmosphere will shift again, and you must not let that window pass without aligning yourself with heaven. God says you have been chosen for this, and you must claim it. God says you have a future filled with light, abundance, peace, and stability. You will have more than enough. You will live a life that once felt impossible. You will experience miracles that others only talk about. God says you are walking into a financial elevation that will change the way you live, the way you think, and the way you see yourself. God says prepare. Because what's coming is bigger than anything you've prayed for. God says open this message fully in your heart. Understand it. Receive it. Pray with it. Trust it. Because heaven is working in your favor right now, and nothing will stop what has already been written for you. God says you are safe. You are loved. You are chosen. You are protected. And this money, this blessing, this breakthrough, is yours. God says trust. Believe. Receive, my beloved child. Breathe for a moment and feel this truth settling into your spirit, because what you are about to read is not a coincidence, not an accident, not a random line of words. This message is reaching you now because heaven has been watching you, guiding you, and preparing something enormous for you, something that has already been released into your destiny, something that carries your name, something that no force on earth can steal unless you ignore this moment. God says you have been given a lot of money, a blessing prepared in the unseen realms, a financial breakthrough that has already been signed, stamped, and delivered into your path. But you must open your heart today, before 11 p.m., before this divine window closes, because heaven is telling you that timing matters and obedience matters. You have walked through seasons that tried to break you, seasons that felt like they were draining your strength, your hope, your faith. You have carried burdens you never told anyone about. You have cried in silence. You have stayed awake at night imagining how life could be if one good miracle finally reached your hands. God saw all of it. God counted every tear, every pain, every silent prayer spoken from the depths of your soul. And today, heaven is speaking directly to you. You won't be left empty-handed anymore. You won't be forgotten. You won't be overlooked. You won't be bypassed. The blessing is real, and its time is now. God says this message is urgent because the door that has opened for you is not a normal door. It is a divine doorway created through everything you have endured. When you suffered, the door began forming. When you stayed kind, the door grew wider. When you forgave, the door gained light. When you trusted even while shaking, the door unlocked. And now the blessing, this financial release, this abundance, this upliftment, is standing right in front of you. This is why God says, open this message today or you will miss the blessing tied to this moment. Not because God wants to scare you, but because God wants to align you. When heaven schedules a miracle, it asks for your participation through faith, awareness, and readiness. You have been given a spiritual assignment today, to trust, to believe, and to step into your blessing without fear. God wants you to know that nothing will go wrong with you. You are safe, protected, and covered. Even when you felt isolated, heaven was surrounding you. Even when you felt like things were falling apart, God was holding the pieces in His hands, preparing to rebuild everything better than before. And now, at this exact moment, God is telling you that the universe has shifted something in your favor. Something huge. Something that carries financial growth, emotional peace, stability, and freedom. This blessing is not small. It is not temporary. It is not symbolic. It is real, and it is meant to change your life. It is meant to break generational limitations. It is meant to open doors that were shut for years. It is meant to bring you comfort after a long period of struggle. God is not giving you just enough. God is releasing abundance, overflow, and divine provision that will meet needs you haven't even spoken about yet. You have been chosen for this because your heart has remained pure despite the trials. You have tried to help people even when you had little. You have respected others even when they wronged you. You have kept quiet even when you could have fought back. Heaven has witnessed your restraint, your kindness, your patience. God says your goodness did not go unnoticed. Your waiting was not wasted. Your pain was not without purpose. Every struggle you faced has been transformed into a seed, and the harvest is arriving now. God wants to remind you today that you are not alone. You never were. Even when you felt abandoned by people you trusted, heaven never left you. Even when you were disappointed by those who promised to support you, heaven stood by your side. Even when your plans collapsed, heaven was constructing new ones behind the scenes. Now the results of that unseen construction are ready to manifest. There is a reason this message came to you today. There is a reason you are reading these words right now. God arranged it. God aligned it. God timed it. Heaven is nudging your spirit, saying, "Don't miss this moment." You must stay awake spiritually. You must stay aligned. You must stay open. You must trust. Because faith is the key that activates everything heaven has already prepared. God is telling you not to fear the blessing. Not to doubt it. Not to question whether you deserve it. You deserve it because you survived what was designed to break you. You deserve it because you kept believing even when nothing made sense. You deserve it because you continued walking forward even when your spirit felt tired. You deserve it because you kept praying even when you didn't feel strong. You deserve it because your heart remained compassionate in a world that often lacks compassion. This blessing is not something you stumbled upon. It is something that was destined for you long before you asked for it. God says, "My child, listen closely, for this is not a message to be ignored. I am speaking to you directly from the heavens, and every word carries the power of my promise. You have been chosen, blessed beyond measure, and a gift is being delivered to you, a gift of abundance, of financial blessing, of provision that will change the course of your life. This money, this divine provision, has already been prepared for you. It is waiting, ready to come into your hands, but there is a condition, a moment in time that is sacred and crucial. You must open this message, hear it fully, embrace it with faith, and act upon it before 11 p.m. today. This is your divine window. If you delay, if you hesitate, the moment will pass,